So my name's Caitlin McElhennon and I'm the Deputy Director of Environmental Justice Network Ireland. And for those who don't know, EGNI is a collaborative research platform and it connects academics, NGOs, lawyers, activists to tackle and address the root causes of environmental injustice across the whole island of Ireland. And we turn this into research into high level advocacy and action. We've already engaged in regards to, we're here today about another national climate plan. So we've already engaged in comprehensive analysis and action during Ireland's NECP revision process. So that's the National Energy and Climate Plan. And it culminated in a complaint to the Commission in November 2024. So last week you might have seen that we published two briefings, one on the EU's Social Climate Fund and Social Climate Plan and what its implications are for Ireland. And the second is a separate briefing, more detailed on the public participation requirements for Ireland's Social Climate Plan. And I'll insert those links into the chat shortly. It's also important to mention that while this webinar is going to focus on Ireland's Social Climate Plan, it is also relevant to other member states who are working on this. So a big welcome to those organisations, and we hope that you find this useful in your own advocacy work. At the end, we will have time for Q&A, so feel free to enter those questions into the chat, and hopefully we'll have time to address all of them. I think that's everything covered on my end, and I'm going to hand it over now to Catherine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kate, and hello and welcome to our second webinar on the Social Climate Plan. So as mentioned, this is the second webinar in our series. We had one last month, where we introduced the EU Social Climate Fund and what Ireland is required to do in terms of developing its national social climate plan. Today we're going to look at some of the policy measures that can ensure a fair and effective transition. So a transition that essentially protects vulnerable households and vulnerable transport users from the financial pressures of ETS2. So just by way as a reminder, I'm conscious that some of you may not have been at last month's webinar. So just as a reminder, the Social Climate Plan, or SCP, it's a key part of the EU Social Climate Fund. The overall goal is to help vulnerable, and the emphasis here is on the word vulnerable, so vulnerable householders, vulnerable micro enterprises, and vulnerable transport users to manage the financial impacts of the new emissions trading system for road transport and buildings, which is known as ETS2. So under ETS2, we will see higher energy and fuel costs, which again is going to put additional strain on those vulnerable to energy and transport poverty. To avail of this fund, the government is required to submit a national social climate plan to the European Commission by June 30th of this year, so just around the corner. It's really important that the government develop a plan that's, of course, well designed, that has equitable measures to protect those most at risk. But importantly, there are a number of requirements which we ran through in last month's webinar, stemming from the regulation on the Social Climate Fund. So requirements in terms of process. So we need to see early and effective public consultation. And then the plan itself needs to set clear measures, milestones, targets for investments in areas like energy efficiency, building renovations, zero and low emission mobility. And the measures need to go beyond kind of short-term financial relief to drive targeted long-term structural change. So Kate mentioned those two resource documents. We go through all of these requirements from a public participation perspective and just in terms of kind of policy and content of the plan. And hopefully the links are in the chat. What we want to achieve from this webinar is to make civil society aware that this is happening. I think we do have some concerns in EGNI that there's, not a lot of awareness about the need for Ireland to develop a social climate plan. So we want to enhance that awareness. We want to make civil society aware of what Ireland is required to do under the regulation. And hopefully you will build some of this into your own advocacy efforts over the coming months. And then we also, I suppose, want to make you ready for when a public participation process does open. But unfortunately, we don't have any information when that's likely going to take place. We haven't been given a timeline yet. We haven't seen a timeline, but we certainly hope that it will be soon. So Kate mentioned the 2 briefings that we've published since the last webinar, and the links will be in the chat. In terms then of this morning, we're very fortunate to have 2 excellent speakers joining us. We have Claire O'Connor, and Claire is Programme Coordinator at Friends of the Earth Ireland. Claire is going to be looking at tackling energy poverty in Ireland's social climate plan. So what are some of the policy solutions for an equitable energy transition? And then we're also delighted to have Professor Brian Caulfield. Professor Caulfield is from the Centre for Transport Research in Trinity College Dublin, and he is going to look at transport poverty in Ireland. What are the challenges, and again, what are some of the equitable solutions? So we're going to go through those presentations first, and then we will open it up for questions. Feel free to pop questions in the chat as we're going through those presentations, and we'll get to them afterwards. I'm going to hand over to Claire first. Claire, if you're okay with that, and then we'll pass over to Professor Caulfield.
Yep, perfect. Thanks a million, Catherine and Caitlin, much appreciated. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to chat today about the social climate plan. I am going to share my screen now if I can. Okay. Yeah, so thanks everyone. I'm going to very briefly talk about how we can tackle energy poverty in Ireland's upcoming social climate plan. And my name is Claire O'Connor. I am the programme coordinator for heat at Friends of the Earth. So I look at decarbonisation of heat and energy efficiency, and also the social justice dimensions of the energy transition. So obviously a big part of that will be this year looking at the social climate plan. The government has to submit their social climate plan by June of this year, which will have to set out exactly how they protect vulnerable households from rising energy prices, which will be coming in 2027. So I'll give you some context around energy poverty in Ireland, the role of the social climate plan, and just what exactly I'm going to cover today. So we saw over the last number of years with the energy crisis that energy poverty rates in Ireland went through the roof. At one point in 2022, 1/3 of households were estimated to be living in energy poverty, which just goes to show the impact of increasing energy prices on households. And we saw in 2022 and 2023 a real situation where people were really stuck and forced to choose between heating and eating. So people were sitting in cold homes. And the impacts, both from a financial perspective and a health perspective, are really significant for households. And if we don't effectively tackle energy poverty, it really does just continue to kind of deepen existing inequalities. And that's why the social climate plan is going to be really, really important. As the ETS2 comes in, carbon pricing on home heating and transport will put more financial pressure on lower income households. And if we don't put in really robust mitigation measures against this, we do again risk deepening inequalities and making energy poverty worse again. So now it's our responsibility as advocates and campaigners and policy experts to put forward the solutions as to how the government can effectively protect vulnerable households from bearing the brunt of increasing energy prices again. So yeah, as I mentioned already, social climate plan is meant to be a framework for mitigating the social impacts of the energy transition. It'll have to make sure that any vulnerable households are protected and supported against rising energy costs. So we'll need to see targeted support, we'll need to see better consumer protections, and we also will need to see kind of structural interventions to actually address the root causes of energy poverty. So I'm going to look today at understanding energy poverty, who is affected and why. I'll look at the gaps in current policy that need to be addressed in the social climate plan, and I'll put forward some policy solutions as well that can deliver a just energy transition as well, because energy poverty is a really multifaceted issue. You have to address income inadequacy, you have to address energy efficiency, and you also have to address high energy costs. So some of the proposals I'll put forward will address each of those, but I'll always be looking at it through an angle of ultimately getting off fossil fuels, because we're a climate organization. So our main focus is getting off fossil fuels in a socially equitable way. Yeah. So who is affected by energy poverty in Ireland? It is widespread energy poverty, but it does disproportionately impact low-income households, people on fixed incomes like pensioners and people with disabilities and people relying on social welfare payments. People in the private rental sector are also disproportionately impacted by energy poverty. They don't have the agency to retrofit their homes themselves. They're often paying extortionate rents already. And then when energy prices go up, like in the energy price crisis, they're the ones who kind of bear the brunt of that, really. People with long-term illnesses and then rural communities as well are more vulnerable to energy poverty. So when we look at last year, 8% of individuals went without heating in 2024 because of cost, which was actually a little bit less than 2023. And that was probably because the energy crisis was slightly less acute, but it goes to show just how vital it is to protect people against energy prices going up. Single parents in particular, 1 in 5 single parent households went without heating last year as well. Cold homes are really they can have a serious impact on children and asthma in particular, and it can also increase absenteeism at school too. So it'll be really important that single parents in particular, those households are targeted in the social climate plan. And then renters are 3 times more likely to be living in energy poverty as well and not able to afford their energy bills. And if you look at, as I said earlier, if you look at the structural causes, the primary one is income inadequacy, but it's also impacted by inefficient housing, high energy prices, and fossil fuel reliance as well. So I won't go too much into the ETS2, but because I think it was covered in the last webinar, but I will just say that the ETS2 will put a carbon price on home heating fuels, like gas and oil, so they will become more expensive in 2027. The vast majority of Irish households use oil and gas in their heating systems at the moment. Oil and gas contribute to 90% of our residential energy emissions. So the majority, I think it's about 50-50 oil and gas dependent in Ireland at the moment. And that will mean that people who are in older, more inefficient homes relying on fossil fuels will then bear disproportionately higher energy bills. So it'll be really important that the ETS2 and the social climate plan has really robust safeguards to protect people against this. And implementation of the social climate plan, it will have to be seized as an opportunity to balance out the social cost of climate action as much as possible. But I will say the social climate plan is not the only mechanism to do that, and there is limited funding available through the social climate plan, and they will have to look at mobilizing additional funding if they are actually to balance out the social costs of rising energy price and of fossil fuels as they continue to increase. And then if we're looking at current, and there is, as I said, a risk of a regressive impact of the ETS2 unless this is done effectively. But to do it effectively, it will require mobilizing more resources, in my opinion, than are currently allocated. So So there are existing gaps in Ireland's approach to tackling energy poverty as well. We don't currently have an active way of identifying people who are in energy poverty. We don't have indicators that are currently being used to identify and target best supports. There's also insufficient funding and accessibility for existing structural measures like retrofitting. People can't access renewable heating to actually get off fossil fuels. And we're also seeing people be locked into fossil fuels through existing government schemes as well, like the Warmer Home Scheme. As well as that, a massive gap that we're seeing is there is zero support available for tenants in the private rental sector to improve the energy efficiency of their home. And the government have committed to introducing minimum BERs this year, but we're yet to see an actual implementation plan for that. So a really big one that we see in Friends of the Earth is that tenants cannot be involved in the energy transition, and there's no supports or protections for them to get involved. And that will have to be addressed in the social climate plan, because as we saw earlier, they're 3 times more likely to be in energy poverty, but of no agency to actually do anything about it right now. So yeah, I think what we will need to see in the social climate plan will be temporary relief with energy bills, support with energy bills, but mainly focusing on long-term structural measures to ultimately get people off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Yeah, so structural solutions and aiming to avoid fossil fuel lock-in. So not looking at types of support that just subsidize fossil fuels further. We need to look at things that actually get people off fossil fuels in the long term. So yeah, when I talk about the kind of targeted immediate support with energy costs, we've been calling for the introduction of an energy guarantee scheme, which would be a minimum energy entitlement for low-income households and people in inefficient homes that's indexed to energy costs, and making sure that everyone can access and afford a basic level of warmth in their home. Another thing that could be done is expanding eligibility for fuel allowance and also introducing social energy tariffs, which has been done very successfully in other EU countries to make sure that vulnerable households can still afford a basic level of energy. And then looking at strengthening consumer protections as well to prevent disconnections, particularly in winter months as well, which was done during the energy price crisis. And we would call for that to be made a permanent fixture for a permanent ban on disconnections, specifically in the winter months. And then looking at energy efficiency as well. So this is the bigger kind of more structural solutions that we would be calling for would be expansion of the social housing retrofit scheme. At the moment, the plan is for the government to just retrofit 25% of all social housing. And they only get funding kind of year on year. There's no multi-annual plan. There's no multi-annual funding as to how they'll retrofit all social housing. Setting out a plan to get them retrofitted and installing renewables on 100% of social housing will be really important, I think, in this. And they will have to start with the worst performing buildings as well. Additionally, to make energy efficiency and retrofit more affordable, they'll need to expand the Warmer Home Scheme. At the moment, the Warmer Home Scheme is available to certain social welfare recipients, but we would see that needs to be expanded to all low-income households as well. And then introducing zero interest loans as well, which has been done in France and the Netherlands quite successfully to help those lower income households afford the deep retrofits without having the upfront financial burden as well. That's on retrofitting. And then when we're looking at making renewable heating more accessible and affordable as well, so ultimately to reduce energy poverty and ultimately to actually achieve lasting solutions that get us off fossil fuel heating, which is going to become more expensive over the years, we need to see a phase out plan for fossil fuel boilers. At the moment, Ireland has the lowest levels of renewable heating in the EU, but we don't have any plan as to how we're actually going to get off renewable heating. We're seeing really strong regulations in terms of new builds that I think they're 97% heat pumps at this point. But for existing buildings, we're really not seeing the uptake of renewable heating solutions. So we need to see a phase out plan for fossil fuel boilers to give people certainty, to give industry certainty. So we all know when we're going to end installation of fossil fuel boilers. Another issue that we've come across is that the Warmer Home Scheme, the free energy upgrade scheme for energy poor households, continues to install oil and gas boilers, which is effectively locking those households into oil and gas for years and years to come. Sorry, I'm quite conscious I'm about to go over time here, so shout if I've gone over time. They continue to install oil and gas boilers basically through our government-funded Warmer Homes Scheme, which is locking those households into fossil fuels for years to come. Those households, the likelihood of them actually going and then installing a heat pump after getting a free oil or gas boiler from the government is really, really small, especially because they're on lower incomes anyway. So it's really important that their government-funded schemes are only funding heat pumps at the moment. I think it was 700 oil and gas boilers installed through that scheme last year and only 40 heat pumps. So it's quite significant. And all those houses will be impacted then by the ETS2 prices going up. It's essential to have post-installation support with operating of these renewable systems as well, to make sure that the systems are running effectively and that people are supported with this totally new way of heating your home. We want to see rebalancing of electricity levies to make sure that electrified heating is the more affordable option, because of fossil fuel subsidies for gas are just so high at the moment that gas is quite significantly cheaper than electricity. So in Denmark, what they've done is rebalance the electricity levies to basically guarantee that over the cost of your boilers or your heat pumps life, it'll be cheaper than your gas or oil boiler. And then the Energy Efficiency Directive requires heating and cooling plans for all local authorities, so that if district heating is the solution for your area, that is flagged with people early, and that district heating rollout is accelerated as soon as possible. The other thing was the private rental sector. This is our main focus in Friends of the Earth over the next year or so. We need to see an introduction of minimum BERs in the private rental sector that will target the absolute worst performing homes. It could start with a minimum BER of a G for rental properties. Basically, the quality of housing in our private rental sector is really, really poor. Minimum BERs would make landlords retrofit the absolute least efficient homes. We also need to see fully funded retrofits for low income renters. So an expansion of the Warmer Home Scheme to include HAP tenants on the condition of a longer term lease being offered, stronger tenant protections against rent evictions, which is when people are evicted because their home is being retrofitted, and tailored support for retrofitting with tenants in situ as well. I'm not checking the chat there, so someone just shout if I'm going over time.
Yeah, we'll give you another minute, Claire. And
perfect.
Then,
yeah. Okay. I won't go.
No, don't rush. Yeah. And then we'll move over.
And the other thing is we need tailored support for people as well, to get energy support and get support with retrofitting as well, to work with health services and NGOs to identify those people in energy poverty and to target support directly to them. And then the big one when we're talking about energy poverty is that we absolutely have to address income inadequacy. Addressing it without addressing the energy efficiency, addressing the high energy cost without addressing energy income inadequacy won't actually solve energy poverty. So it's really important that any solutions that are being put forward ultimately address income inadequacy in tandem. And this was just the point around mobilizing additional finance. At the moment, the government have to contribute 25% minimum towards the ETS, their social climate plan. But obviously, all of these policy solutions that I'm put forward will require a significantly bigger contribution than that. And if we look at the fossil fuel subsidies that the government gave out in 2022, there was 4.7 billion there. So I think there's opportunity to mobilize some of those fossil fuel subsidies towards protecting vulnerable households from high energy prices again. I won't go on too much longer, but there's just a need for indicators and definition of energy poverty to effectively target any of these solutions. We need structural solutions that avoid fossil fuel lock-in, and we need to mobilize additional finance beyond what is already committed to. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. Thank you. I know there are a number of questions and comments in the chat, and we'll move to them after Professor Caulfield's presentation. So just over to you, Brian, and thank you.
Super. I'm just trying to share as well. Just checking that you can see that.
Yes.
Okay, super. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here this morning to talk to you about transport poverty. It's something I've done a good bit of research on recently, and I'll go through some of the findings that we have. So in terms of the first thing to start off with are the challenges, and what are these? So this image here is from Chapter 11 of the EPA's recent State of the Environment report. I was the chief author on the transport chapter. And a lot of this stuff is obviously very well known, that the emissions from transport are going up still, despite how much we're spending on it. Most of the emissions are coming from cars, and that 71% of all trips in 2023 were taken by car. So to get to, I suppose, to get to the further points about transport poverty and why it's maybe locked in, I just want to kind of explore some of the mobility issues around the country. The first one being, so this is from the National Transport Authority National Household Travel Survey, and it shows the percentages of people right across the country that have access within a 15-minute walk to a shop, to doctor surgery, all of these different types of amenities. So you can see the percentages, or the number, or the population estimates that have this type of access. So the modes of transport are used to get to those. 71% are by car, 18% are walking, bus and coach 4%, trucks 3%, cycle 2%, the rail is 1%, and other is 1%. We hear an awful lot about cycling, and cycling being, and it is definitely a solution, but the majority of people we need to move are to reduce is the 71% of people that are traveling by car. This is a time series of what's happened in terms of the numbers of people taking, or the percentages of mode share. So here you can see in 2012, car was 70.1%, and last year it was 70.9%. So we are not really achieving what we need to do in this sector at all. And not to pick on cycling again, but I suppose the reason I do is because it gets an awful lot of funding and an awful lot of attention. As you can see here, it went up a little bit, but it's going back down again. So we're not getting the wins that we need on that mode, or are we getting the wins that we need on any of the other modes, really, when you look at the data. And this is not census data. This is from the National Household Travel Survey. So this is all trips. If you look at the census, some modes do better than others, but the census only accounts for about 25% of all of the trips that we make. So obviously there's regional disparities. So Dublin and its suburbs, there's huge connectivity, there's huge amount of amenities within a 15-minute envelope. So bus stops, shops, etc. Very large proportions of our population are within a 50-minute walk of these. But then when you go to the other cities, so all of the other cities in Ireland are lumped together: Galway, Cork, Limerick, and Waterford. And you can see that the accessibility starts to drop off somewhat when you go outside of Dublin. But then when you get to rural Ireland, this is where we really start to see where individuals do not have access within a 50-minute walk to any of these amenities. And this is where we see transport poverty, and this is where we see the requirement for people to own a private car. So if you look at our population distribution as per the census, you can see that the majority of people, 24.5%, live in Dublin and its suburbs. And then you can see that the population across the other cities is relatively small, but then you start to get to the towns and villages, and you can see the remainder of the country are basically rural Ireland, which is larger in terms of population than Dublin. In terms of density, where are we? So these are all the EU 27, and with the population density. So we have a very low population density compared to the rest of Europe. Keeping Malta in there is a bit of an outlier because it is very densely populated, small little island. But you can see we are at 72 people per square kilometre, and the EU average is over here, and the EU average is 86 people per square kilometre. So basically, the tools we have to work off initially are the fact that the country has a very, very high car ownership and car usage levels, and it is very sparsely populated. So what are the policies to reduce emissions? So the big one that was there from the last government, and I assume this government too, is the 50% reduction in emissions by the end of the decade. So how the Climate Action Plan seeks to do this is to reduce vehicle kilometers by 20%, reduce fuel consumption by 50, increase active modes of travel, increase public transport trips, and to sell roughly about 1 million electric vehicles. So those are the goals that have been baked into the most recent Climate Action Plan. The one that I tend to talk about a lot in terms of the equity is the car one, and selling 1 million electric cars, and how equitable selling a million electric cars really is. Catherine said something at the start about the mechanisms by which we can change both energy and transport. The key thing for transport is that we change how we value transport. We change how DEPR and the Department of Finance value transport. If you have 4 transport projects, 2 of them are motorways and 3 of them are light rail lines, the motorways will win with the better cost-benefit ratio every single time. You only need to see that in Galway. When they looked at the Galway transport plan, the ring road was put in, and some bus activity as well, but then a light rail line was put in, and every single option that had the motorway won in terms of the cost-benefit ratio. So these are the big things that we need to do. So how do we do this? So first of all, you need a paradigm to do this. Avoid, shift, improve. I'm sure the slides are going to be available. I don't expect everyone to read this, but this is from an upcoming Encyclopedia for Transport and Society, where I defined the methods to reduce emissions in transport using the avoid, shift, improve. But what I suggest is that we also look at co-benefits, and that kind of is broken into this model. So we look to avoid and reduce the need to travel, to move to more sustainable modes of transport, and then to better power the modes of transport that we have left. The way in which we can sell this to government and policymakers and the general public is that by doing all of this, and some of it will be difficult, without a shadow of, and it will be very expensive to do what we want to do in Dublin. Not to even get to our 50% emissions target could cost up to 40 billion euro to achieve that. And that's because of chronic underfunding in public transport in this city and all of our cities for decades. But we need to focus on the co-benefits, to think about the health benefits, the air quality benefits, obviously the emissions, the mindfulness and well-being. Accessibility is a key thing. In Ireland, 1.1 million people identify as having a disability, and of that, it's 6 or 9%, I can't remember which, use public transport, but it's less than 10% actually use public transport. And then to make it safe as well. So this is government policy currently. How do we do this? We avoid, shift, improve, and of the heavy lifting here, it's under the improve banner. So 58% of our emissions reductions in transport are to come from selling all these electric cars. And how is that going? So first of all, these are the sales of vehicles in Ireland between 2014 and 2024, and you can see this purple line here. This is the one that is the only one that really counts, is the number of electric vehicles, pure battery electric vehicles. And you can see in 23 they were up, and then you can see the dip that we have, the 25% drop in sales in the interim. And then you can see petrol and diesel, while they're getting smaller, the electric aren't getting big anywhere near quick enough. And then the other thing that is a concern are the SUVs. The purple here are all types of cars that are sold in Ireland, and then the green, red, and blue are the different types of SUVs that are being sold. So you can see over the past decade, the majority of vehicles now that we're selling, brand new cars that we're selling, are SUVs. The reason why this is important, I suppose, is because they get grants, and similar to anybody else that's going to purchase, if they're electric vehicles. But for every one SUV that we sell, for every 5 SUVs that we sell, it knocks out the benefit of one electric car. Basically, because the large SUVs, so in this green line here, they produce 20% extra emissions compared to a regular car. So looking at the equity, so the QR codes here, if you're quick enough, should be able to link you into the paper, but I know that the slides will be available as well. So this was a paper we published in 22. And it looks at the equity impacts of giving everybody an electric car. And there was recently a report put out by the Climate Change Advisory Council and the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, and it was bloody awful. It didn't mention equity. It didn't mention public transport. It didn't mention rural. It basically said in transport, give everybody an electric car and we're sorted. That is absolutely the wrong thing to do. You lock ourselves into car ownership, and we lock ourselves into congestion. I was very surprised by the people that are on the Climate Change Advisory Council actually approving that message that went out. But anyway, it did. So what are the equity impacts? We sell all our cars in Dublin, all our new electric cars in Dublin. We sell a lot of them in Cork and in Galway as well. And they're being sold in the areas, and this is just this here is the deprivation index. And I'm not going to go through the linear regressions and all the rest that are in the paper. But basically what we showed was that where the electric cars have been sold are in the wrong places, because the people that are getting the benefit of them are the people that already have a car. And the deprivation index, excuse me, that we use here is the Pubble-Haas deprivation index. And then you can see it even more acutely here in Dublin. So you can see the wealthiest parts are in yellow, and that's where you see the highest concentrations of electric car ownership. So say, for example, this part of Dublin, where you've got light rail, you've got DART, you've got the best bus networks in the country, has the highest numbers of EV grants. Then when you compare that to somewhere like, say, Donegal, where public transport is very poor, they get the same level of grants. So there does need to be some sort of equity put into the system. Sorry, Nan. So in terms of the disadvantage, and this is something that Claire mentioned in her paper, or in her presentation, about how to find where this disadvantage is. So this was a paper that was published in 21, where we looked at finding where car dependency is in rural parts of Ireland. So we used a few data sets, the first one being a public transport density mapping, where public transport is, deprived areas, identification of forced car ownership, where people have no alternative other than to own a vehicle, a private vehicle, and then also to look at rural transport. So within this Venn diagram here in the center, you can see the areas that have potential forced car ownership. So they have high levels of deprivation, low access to public transport, and high share of single car ownership per family, because that's what they can afford. So then when you look at the maps here, you can see the deprivation index. So the red areas are the areas that we're highly confident that there is this deprivation, or this deprivation related to transport. And then also in terms of transport disadvantage, you can start to see the parts of the country where there is a lot of transport disadvantage. So this analysis was done using census data. We are updating it with the 2022, and it's about to go to review the paper. But the maps haven't really changed all that much. So what you see here are the areas across the country. These orange areas are areas that people are in potential forced car ownership. These are the areas that we need to be concentrating any policy measures on to improve accessibility, and particularly around electric cars. Because if you look at the rural areas of, say, Mayo and Donegal, where we have this forced car ownership, public transport isn't feasible. It's not viable to run it, and it may be even higher emission if we're running lots of buses around. So that's where I think we need to really be focusing our efforts in terms of electric vehicle penetration. But I've been saying this for maybe at least 7 years. I said it at the the Citizens Assembly on Climate Action back in 2017, and I was kind of laughed out of the room saying, my point was, why were we giving people huge grants to feel better about driving? And I still have that feeling, especially in and around the areas that have really good public transport. So this is the last of the papers, and this was one that was published recently in Transport Economics. And basically what we did was we looked at the challenge of making EVs just affordable enough, and looking at the impact. And even if we did do it and made them affordable enough, like the Climate Change Advisory Council are suggesting, and the 15,000, I think they said they would spend 4 or 5 billion on electric cars to get a really quick win. Well, first of all, there wouldn't be that kind of vehicle stock to come into the country that quickly, because there's a huge lag in terms of electric vehicles, and that is still there to get that quantum of vehicles in. But that's a stopgap, that's us putting a sticking plaster on it until 7 or 8 years, when the vehicles become they then become obsolete and aren't working for the users. So what we looked at, and I'll skip through this one really quickly, but what we looked at were scenarios around the purchasing electric vehicles. We looked at people at risk of poverty, and we looked at their weekly disposable income as per the census. We looked at the price of an electric vehicle, and how they paid it back. And then even if there was a 20% reduction in the total cost of an electric vehicle. The vehicles that we looked at were the Renault Zoe, and we also looked at the VW ID4, and we looked at the price of those paying them back over 3 or 5 year loans. And this is what we found. So basically, each of these are related to scenarios. And along the x-axis at the bottom, you can see the percentage of households that could actually afford to purchase one of these vehicles. So at the very top, you see obviously Dublin City and the Dublin areas, that they have much higher ability to pay for these vehicles. And this is just the cities. The analysis also looks at at rural Ireland, and those percentages get even less. So if we better kitchen sink on electrification of the private vehicle, but there's huge social and social justice questions to be asked about this, and selling all these private vehicles in wealthy areas has never sat right with me, and I think it's a very bad policy. So what are some of the solutions? I'll go through this quickly. So this is something that's launching tomorrow in Galway. It's a project that we're running with SEAI, ESB Enterprise, and the Atlantic Technical University. And this was yesterday, so hopefully it's being cleaned up before the launch tomorrow. So this is on the west side of the city by the library, and there you can see we are launching a shared rental scheme for cargo bikes, electric bikes, and then just at the far end there, you'll see there's 2 spaces for shared electric cars that will be there. So sharing these options and getting rid of the cost of ownership is definitely one of the things that we should and could be doing. This other one comes from Los Angeles, and I really like this scheme, and I think this is something that we could definitely do here in Ireland. This is a snapshot of how it was performing. That was the best infographic I could find, but I know it's performing even better. So now there's 200 vehicles, and the double in number of people enrolled. So basically what it is are like Dublin Bikes, obviously, but shared electric vehicles right around the city. And if you're on lower income, you get you get a reduced rate of rental for these electric cars. So you're getting rid of the ownership cost, and you're enabling people to get the mobility that they need at a lower cost. It's Los Angeles. A lot of people use cars. There's all of those other things that come with a city like LA. But a system like this was also introduced in France, and it also had a huge success. Things that we're doing are working, as much as I'm critical of some of the things that we are doing. So this was from 2 weeks ago. This is Bus Connects, and we haven't even put a shovel in the ground yet for Bus Connects. So this is just by changing the bus routes and adding more bus routes. In terms of emissions, we're able to do all of this. We're able to achieve much greater frequency, much greater coverage. And as you can see, there are 48% increase in passenger boardings in areas that have had a new Bus Connect service introduced. So that's phenomenal. Internationally speaking, that is phenomenal. And then the last one I think I have here is Connecting Ireland. Another thing that's working. This is something that's working in rural Ireland. and it's working really well. There are delegations from other countries coming to Ireland to figure out how we're doing this and how we're able to do it so well. So the numbers of services that have been launched, and I think the number of services jumped from, I think it was number of passengers jumped from about 1.2 million to 3.4 million passengers last year. So the more of this we can do, the better. But there are certain parts of Ireland that even with a Connecting Ireland service, they still won't be able to achieve what they want to achieve, and that's where we really need to look at that targeted electrification. And I've probably gone over time, sorry.
Quick conclusion, Brian. Or
There you go. But the main
perfect.
quick conclusion I would say is we need to change how we value how we value transport in Ireland. We need to work with and we need to demand from government and DEPA especially that we change the parameters around cost benefit analysis. And we can't, there are some very many good methodologies for including social justice into cost benefit analysis or models, but those are the things that result in decisions being made. Like say, for example, right now, there's a 2,000 word document on its way to, or it's been submitted to An Bord Pleanála for a 4-kilometer extension of the Finglas, of the Luas to Finglas. And that will hinge on a cost benefit ratio of those 2,000 pages. But also, it's a 4-kilometer line and it's going to take 10 years to build. That's the other side of it. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Brian. Two really fascinating and really interesting and really important presentations. So thank you both. We have 10 minutes remaining, and I do see there is a lot of activity in the chat. So I am just going to go to the first from, I think it's the Irish Green Building Council. I'm just going to read them out. Probably this is for you, Claire. Top 5 priorities in terms of policy solutions. In the sake of time, can we keep it to 3? Do you want to just name them off and then we can move on to the next comments?
Honestly, it's very difficult because it's such a multifaceted issue. I would say targeting the private rental sector, number 1 for sure. Retrofitting all social housing and then introducing an energy guarantee scheme to make sure that everyone has access to the minimum amount of energy needed to live that's necessary, really. Yeah. There's probably way more than that. I could talk about it for ages, but yeah.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm actually going to bring in Eleanor Scott to address the next question from Eva. Eva asks, given the relatively small size of the SCF, how do you see the chances of pulling in additional funding, and then using the social climate plan as a means to launch test structural measures that reach the most vulnerable? You can read the remainder of the question in the chat. Eleanor, you're with Carbon Watch. Can you address that for us, please?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm from Carbon Market Watch. We work on trying to make ETS2 more fair and effective, basically through stronger social climate plans and more complementary policies. But yeah, so in terms of Ava's question, I would say a key thing in terms of advocacy around the social climate plan is trying to keep drawing attention to the need for more funding and how there is more funding here. So we'll have the ETS2 revenue, which will be way bigger. So at a price of €45 a ton, so kind of more on the conservative side of the pricing, it will be around 2.7 billion in funding in the first 5 years. So compared to just the 600 million of the social climate plan, we really need to put pressure on the government basically to say we can use all this money for the same aims of the social climate plan. So the policy priorities that Claire identifies, and then Ava also mentions that this does really link in with other policy priorities like the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So that targets those in the worst performing buildings who are often in energy poverty. So the Social Climate Plan and the National Building Renovation Plan under that can really should be aligning. And we're seeing that in a lot of member states are doing these plans kind of separately, whereas we should be looking at them together in terms of making the most of the resources that we have.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. On to the next. This is for you, Brian. Louise mentions Finland and Sweden, with even that are even more sparsely populated in Ireland. Are there figures on reliance on car or how their public transport serves rural areas?
So I'm not specifically sure about Sweden and Finland on how they do it. In terms of their car dependency, they're pretty similar to Ireland once you go outside of the main cities. But in Scotland, they've done something, or they're trying to do something very similar to us with Connecting Ireland and the buses. But what they do with the electric vehicles in Scotland is that they give grants to people living in rural parts of Scotland, to get domestic chargers, and also they're looking into, and they maybe have implemented it, discounted electricity rates for charging. So those are two very quick wins we could be doing here in Ireland, to help with the transition.
Excellent, thanks. Just Ava then as well, you asked the recent EU Clean Industrial Deal proposed to use the SCF for social leasing for electric vehicles and heat pumps. Brian, Claire, any thoughts on kind of a leasing model? Ava also mentions how a large portion of energy poor are members of the travellers community. Evaluation showed that they remained energy poor due to a lack of infrastructure and halting sites. Very, very valid point. So just, do you want to address that comment and then the question around social leasing?
On the traveller community, I think, yeah, they are like the most vulnerable to energy poverty. I think before the energy crisis, 3/4 of the traveller community were in energy poverty. So they probably went up to about 100% in the energy crisis. I think that issue of trying to implement a solution and it not working just shows the importance of really effective consultation with impacted communities. Because I think if you'd spoken to those communities, if there was an ongoing dialogue with those communities, we wouldn't be seeing those kind of impacts from solutions that are supposed to solve the problem, you know? So I think it just goes to show how important it is to have really effective, strong, and inclusive public consultation. I don't know much about social leasing though, so I don't have anything to say on that.
Brian, any thoughts on social leasing? Eleanor also asked about social leasing for EVs, and other member states are doing it.
It's been very effective. It was oversubscribed in France when it was launched. That system that's there in Los Angeles as well. We need to be looking into it, and we need to be. That's where the quick win is. It's not spending 4 billion, and so there's one for everyone in the audience. Electric vehicle. We need to target this. Some people can afford to buy electric vehicles, and they have bought them. We need to be able to target it, and then I couldn't agree with Claire more. We need dialogue. We need to be co-creating solutions. We're not going to get through this without talking to everybody possible.
Yeah, and that just speaks to, Hannah, your comment about socially targeted subsidies for EVs in the RHSCP rather than offering to everybody. And I know I was just looking at the programme for government last week, and again, it was all, you know, it didn't seem particularly targeted in terms of EV policy. We don't know what's going to be in Ireland's social climate plan, but hopefully when the public participation process opens, that you'll have that opportunity to advocate for something targeted, because that's what the regulation calls for. Just going back, Mary, you raised the comment about sustainable energy communities. If they were working, would we not need community advisors? Claire, do you want to address that comment?
Yeah, it's a fair point, and I think there are issues with sustainable energy communities that do need to be addressed. Ultimately, what we're calling for is a specific role that's funded, that proactively works with health services and NGOs, and actually goes to households who are in energy poverty. So I think there is a role for sustainable energy communities. A lot of people who are in energy poverty aren't in a position to be able to get involved with a sustainable energy community. So I still think there is a role for a specific community energy advisor, as well as strengthening sustainable energy communities and kind of bolstering their resources and ability to do much more outreach themselves.
Yeah, and I'm aware that that is an aspect of how the funding can be used, so that kind of support, advice, architecture around the various measures in the plan. Judy, you made a point about, is the government listening at all to you, Brian? And I think that's a good question, because when I was listening to you, I'm conscious that the ERSI, for example, are doing modelling work on energy poverty. Who is doing work on, you know, modelling around transport poverty? Obviously within academia, we've seen your work, but from that kind of policy driven perspective.
So within the NTA and in TII, there are now guidelines on how that they bring in those aspects of just transition and other aspects. So there are based within the models, but that's great, and it gives you, you know, something in, say, a multi-criteria analysis. But what's much more important is that it gets into the cost benefit analysis, and that you measure the benefits much higher. And until we change that system in transport, I think in energy as well, it's always going to be broken, that we won't be able to, as I said before, you know, light rail lines won't be justified. Like metro is going to cost a part of the very, very upper echelons if absolutely everything went wrong, 23 billion, and I don't for a second think it will cost that much. But to show the benefits of it and the social benefits of it are so important, and we need an agreed mechanism. I think that's something that it would be very good to put into the call for submissions on how we value it, and not in terms of monetary, but how we value it as a society and as a nation.
Excellent. Okay, conscious of time, so thank you to both Brian and to Claire for their excellent contributions, and thank you to everybody for your questions and your comments. Hopefully we will see a public consultation open anytime very soon on the social climate plan. It is something that we are calling for within EJNI, particularly given that the June deadline is fast approaching. So I might just hand it over to you, Cath, just to do a final wrap up.
Yes, thanks everyone, and thanks especially to the speakers. And it was great to see so many interesting questions and comments in the chat. And we'll definitely address those as we continue our advocacy and analysis. And yes, just to mirror what Catherine's saying, hoping for any information on when the consultation is out. That will really take us to the next step. But yes, thank you all so much, and I will follow up with the recording, and I'll send around the briefings as well along with them. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.